It's a commonly held misconception that during the early years of home computing, adventure games in the United States and Japan went in two separate directions, with American games concentrating on puzzle design and Japanese games moving more towards linear, narrative-based experiences. But the truth of the early days is much muddier, and Western-developed adventure games had surprising ties to the history of Japanese personal computing, with multiple attempts to export their burgeoning classics of the American adventure genre overseas. Sometimes even while these same companies tried their hand at bringing Japanese games of other genres to the United States. And one of the most interesting things about this is that the two largest titans of adventure games in the West would have interesting and varied experiences throughout the 80s and 90s trying to export their titles, attempting multiple strategies, none of which ever really stuck. But the story of these attempts goes in all sorts of bizarre directions. From an initially adverse relationship with Japanese adventure game developers due to a legal threat over two games with the same title, to an importing deal with a Japanese software company eventually leading to the establishment of a foreign satellite office that failed despite very high promotion in contemporary magazines, to a famous adventure game company's domestic development of a primitive, massively multiplayer online game that would be sold to a Japanese computer hardware company and iterated on across decades. And finally, to a domestically developed series of unique ports with their own unique promotions made for them that ended up being very fondly remembered, even if they were designed for systems that would never have American exposure. These are the stories of the attempts of Sierra to both bring their adventure titles to Japan and import Japanese titles to the United States, and the highly unusual tale of how LucasArts, then Lucasfilm Games, worked with multiple companies to try to establish a dominant presence in Japan, succeeding unexpectedly and beyond their wildest dreams in one instance, and failing at all other instances at a large level, while somehow managing to leave a lasting cult legacy. And, like most things in the 1980s computer industry, these stories all start with the threat of a lawsuit. In the early days of Japanese computing, a not insignificant amount of early hobbyists concentrated on the importing of American and European games, particularly for systems like the Apple II and Commodore PET. You can see this reflected in articles of early magazines like ASCII's burgeoning computer magazine Login, which had large sections devoted to companies like Infocom, with their coverage of early adventure games being a highlight. One series in particular that got a loving look was Online Systems' high-res adventure collections, and in particular, Roberta Williams' seminal murder story, Mystery House. This story is well tread, but a dentist in Japan would play that game and would make their own version of it. A game that in practice would resemble a hunt for a treasure-style game much more than a straight-up murder mystery. However, once a game with the same title as a prolific online systems release would achieve high sales in Japan, it would get the company that would become Sierra's attention. And the common story here is that a lawsuit was created and put Sierra off of working with Japan. According to recent information from developer conferences, though, this story is completely incorrect. As stated at a recent reunion by the development staff of Microcabin, the company that released the Japanese version of Mystery House, the only thing sent out towards them from Online Systems was a more general threat about the use of the name of their game, which they immediately went to their own lawyers about. What they found out was highly unusual. Due to legal wrangling, they would eventually have to take the product off the shelves, but before then, they had 2 years of free reign to sell their title. This would cause them to create a bunch of sequels and clones, notably Mystery House 2 and Worry, and competitors would create even more in the same style, such as Monster House, Horror House, and many, many others. In a way, Online Systems' threat backfired, because the action of finding out about the time limitation caused a flood of adventure games to hit the Japanese market. So, in the process of trying to take something off of the shelves, Online Systems ended up inadvertently expanding the adventure game genre in Japan considerably. After Online Systems had fully morphed into Sierra, head of the company and husband to Roberta, Ken Williams, would eventually go with an alternate strategy, releasing their own version of Roberta Williams' Mystery House in Japan. And longtime viewers of this channel will recognize the name they went with for the port: Starcraft, Minoru Nakazawa's company that had a great deal of involvement in the early porting of Ultima games to Japan. Due to the room locations in the Online Systems Mystery House being stored as vectors in 6502 assembly, as found in this lecture by game historian and Professor Lane Nooney, and backed up by Williams in his autobiography Not All Fairy Tales Have Happy Endings, giving the source code to Starcraft was not practical for the conversion, as the Japanese programmers would be coding the game in BASIC. This narrative runs a bit counter to the traditional internet retelling that the port wasn't cared about. And after receiving some concept art and documentation, the programmers at Starcraft would redraw the graphics completely, while taking inspiration from the game's own successors, such as Hiroyuki Imabayashi of Thinking Rabbit's The Keyhole Murder Case. Due to this, Starcraft's Mystery House has the sheen of an upgrade rather than a port, and it would end up selling very well for Sierra and Starcraft, although it wouldn't touch the ubiquity of the high sales of Microcabin's Mystery House variants. After all of that conflict, though, a couple years down the line, Mystery House itself would become public domain, making the whole event a bit of a tempest in a teapot in retrospect. For their part, Sierra would continue to license out their games for Starcraft conversion, including other entries in the high-res adventure series, leading to ports of The Wizard and the Princess and Time Zone, both converted to a Japanese parser. And a funny thing happened due to these conversions. As Starcraft continued to do them, they became better at them, even releasing faster machine language-only ports of earlier titles. This is especially notable in Roberta Williams' adventure game developed in conjunction with Lucasfilm that was based on the 1980s fantasy film The Dark Crystal, as Starcraft's Japanese ports for NEC computers would introduce quite a bit more color to the graphics than the Western versions. But it would be their next title after that, and one of the last that Starcraft would do for Sierra, that would show the biggest increase in their skill. Released in 1987, Las Vegas was a reinterpretation of one of Online Systems' earliest games, and one of the most notable early adult adventure games, Soft Porn Adventure, a game designed by Technology Systems' Chuck Benton that was picked up by Ken Williams upon encountering it for publication. The Starcraft variant, though, is quite a bit different. Although it maintains more or less the same puzzles and parser translated into Japanese, it has unique full-color graphics that make the game much closer to contemporary Japanese adventure games of the time. One of the most interesting things about Las Vegas is that it would actually beat out another more famous conversion of Soft Porn Adventure, beating Leisure Suit Larry to store shelves by a couple of months. Despite this strong showing from Starcraft, though, Sierra's strategy would soon change, as a fateful trip to Japan would bring the relationship between the two countries back into focus and change how they handled game porting. In 1986, Ken Williams went on an exploratory trip to Tokyo, with the intent of checking out the video and computer game market. As stated in his biography, this was kind of a lousy trip for the Williams family at first. Roberta wasn't taken seriously by the Japanese corporation Sierra was meeting with, and Ken generally had prior negative feelings about console games that were clouding his viewpoint. Williams, at that time, hated the cartridge and lower-end computer market, as an ill-advised prior investment into Atari 400, VIC-20, the TI-99 and multiple console software companies, right during the video game crash of 1983, had caused large problems for Sierra when Williams was trying to get it off the ground. And while he was impressed with the performance of the Famicom and the complexity of the games available for it, the thing that interested Ken Williams the most was NEC's computer dominance in the Japanese market, both for offices with the PC-98 and for general software use with the PC-88. While on the trip, one game in particular would catch Ken Williams' eye: Tegasa, a transforming mech arcade game. And at least according to the possibly exaggerated ad copy of Sierra's own magazine's 10th anniversary issue, he would become rather addicted to it in stores, so much so that some of them would ask him to leave. He would take that game, and a PC-88, back with him to the United States, with the intent of porting the game and getting in touch with the creators to strike a distribution deal. Williams, in his autobiography, feels that the magazine article exaggerated the story a bit, and places the blame on his brother, the editor, stating that he always tended to write in an exaggerated fashion. Exaggerated or not, work would progress on conversion of the game. Tegasa, localized as Thexter in the United States, would be ported by Sierra, with work from programmer Mickey Lee and assistance from Synergistic Software. And the game would come out for the Tandy Color Computer, PC, Apple IIgs, Macintosh, and the Tandy 1000. It would end up a spectacular seller for the company. And while we don't have an exact number, we know it sold over 500,000 units worldwide at minimum, making it an unusually large success. And Sierra, with the help of a friend that would become very important later, would strengthen their relationship with the maker, Game Arts. Sierra would establish further deals with them, and with other Japanese companies, bringing over more ports like Sylpheed and Nihon Falcom Sorcerian. Sylpheed in particular would be promoted aggressively in Sierra's official magazines, with great emphasis placed on the quality and variety of the in-game music tracks. Oddly, Zeliar didn't have as much of an emphasis as other titles. While Sorcerian would get a hilariously inaccurate multi-page write-up in Sierra's official magazine, stating that it was the first ever Japanese RPG, a factoid so wrong I don't even know how to begin with it, Zeliard only got a mention, despite eventual Dagger of Amon-Ra designer Josh Mendel heading the production, and longtime Sierra Manual staff writer Marty McKenna handling translation duties. Additionally, another internet rumor has plagued Zeliard for years, with rumors about a botched Japanese to Spanish to English translation making up the DOS port. However, the game's cult fan base and fan sites have since been able to establish this wasn't the case, and it's actually a fairly solid localization for the time. But it's here, finally, that Sierra begins expanding in the opposite direction and considering domestic offices on foreign shores. Williams would appoint Ed Nagano, who had went with him on that trip to Japan and strengthened the relationship with them in Game Arts, as head of a company called Sierra Japan KK, a satellite office formed with the mission of bringing over their best-selling adventure games to Japanese markets. Japanese magazines would almost immediately profile the new company with a long feature in Micom Basic magazine. In an interview with Nagano, he stated a bit more about his concerns.
When it comes to porting software between Japan and the United States, there must be adjustments made to suit each country's climate and characteristics. For example, it must be said that getting a Japanese person to comprehend dry American humor can be quite a difficult task. Knowing how to adapt, that is the key.
The first game to be handled by Sierra Japan KK would be Police Quest 2, with Quest for Glory 1 following not soon after. Leisure Suit Larry 1 was planned but not released, possibly due to these localization concerns, but most likely as not to conflict with Starcraft's Las Vegas reinterpretation. And it's here where we have a more humorous example of localization going the other way than is usually talked about, as the changes made in the PC-98 version of Police Quest 2 have become a bit of a meme in their own right. Worked on by Sierra staff and Nagano himself, one of the particular aspects of it that is concerning is that the conversion architects did not have a professional artist among them. So when the localization call was made to give the characters a more anime-styled look, Nagano, Ken Nishiyuye, Pablo Guinness, and Stuart Goldstein were assigned the conversion instead of existing Police Quest 2 animators Cheryl Lloyd and Vu Nguyen. While some of the staff members had some graphics design experience, they weren't exactly artists. And the results of trying to change the art style were this, creating a bit of a caricature which overwhelms any other impression of the port. Which is a bit of a shame, really, as there's a lot to admire here once you ignore the admittedly black hole-sized elephant in the room, including a fully functional Japanese parser and solid text conversion work by staff translator Akiko Skellerup. If that name sounds familiar, she was one of the translators working on some Working Designs games later in her career, notably Popful Mail's Sega CD version and the original version of Lunar 2 Eternal Blue. This version of Police Quest 2 has become somewhat notorious due to the art, but it seems that Sierra had a lesson learned here, and would end up being much closer to their art design in future projects. Of course, most of these being for NEC's PC-98 would cause an uptick in resolution but a reduction of colors, making EGA the graphic system of choice for porting. Quest for Glory 1 in particular would be virtually identical to its US counterpart, coming in both 8 and 16 color versions that both look incredibly strong, and putting the odd conversion of Police Quest 2 in the rearview mirror. Some of the more consistently positively reviewed ports would be the exports of Sierra's educational games for children, notably the 1991 CD-ROM remake of Mixed Up Mother Goose. Mixed Up Mother Goose in particular got a loving write-up in Login magazine, praising the game's use of multimedia and gentle puzzles. Another title that localized well and had a positive reaction was Corey Cole's puzzle collection, The Castle of Dr. Brain. The sad truth of it, though, was that adventure games from Sierra didn't sell as well as expected, but it wasn't for lack of press, once again, despite what the internet will tell you. Login magazine in particular provided extensive coverage of Sierra's game, with months of ink on Space Quest 4 in particular. Impressed by the graphics and tonal jumps inherent to that story, while being a science fiction comedy game first and foremost, Space Quest 4 is a bit of an anomaly in that series, as it has some rather dark and sad moments and elements of horror in some sections. They not only provided extensive previews and an unscored but glowing review, but also an extensive walkthrough of about the first half of the game. Amusingly, some of the age-long frustrations that American and European players have voiced with that game are also voiced in Japanese publications, making note of difficult puzzles like the Energizer Bunny one, the tricky nature of the slime capture, and the first coordinate puzzle where the player themselves has to randomly generate a coordinate to a location that they'll have to remember later without any indication that they need to write it down. Particular note was given to the awful controls of the Mall Zero Gravity Chase section, proving that for all of their innovation, joy, and memories, awful Sierra game adventure game arcade sequences transcend all cultural boundaries in universal player hatred. Space Quest 4 wouldn't be the only game to get extensive coverage in the magazine. The enhanced graphics of King's Quest V's FM Towns version, as well as its Japanese voice acting, would be hyped considerably, as well as some increase in sound quality. And it's honestly a very solid port, even addressing one of the most common complaints of the English version. While his voice remains remarkably similar, Cedric the Owl is much less grating in Japanese, sounding a bit reserved and cautious rather than outwardly cowardly. Graham is the standout, though, voiced by an unknown actor, and everything has a relaxed quality to it. While the voice acting won't win any awards, it's very easy on the ears and has a bit of an unfairly maligned reputation. King's Quest V's FM Towns version also has a highly unusual development quirk. An accessible alternate English language track is a much earlier version of recorded dialogue than on the US releases of the game, as discovered by users on the forum Vogons a number of years ago. This has led to a persistent and annoying rumor that the FM Towns version was developed first or released earlier. This is demonstrably not true, and although we cannot pin down the exact date, we know it's after the initial PC releases. It's also worth noting that Sierra Acquisition Dynamics was also getting a share of the hype, with long features dedicated to both Willy Beamish and Rise of the Dragon. Well, Rise of the Dragon would get a wonderful port worked on by Bits Laboratory for the Mega CD, with assistance from longtime Sierra ally Game Arts, once again featuring full Japanese voice acting and some smart graphical conversion. Data on the heavily hyped Willy Beamish conversion remains elusive. Although there's an American and European release, I could find no evidence of it ever coming out for the Mega CD in Japan. There might be a simple reason for this, though. Due to lack of sales, Sierra Japan KK would bow out of porting adventure games shortly after these releases, being shut down by the mother office. And honestly, it's easy to see why. Despite Login's extensive coverage, none of the games featured even cracked the multiple top 20s featured in Login magazine. I don't think this was due to game quality, though. Looking at the charts, they are completely dominated by strategy games, with entries in the Romance of the Three Kingdoms and Daisen Ryaku series dominating the top spots for most of the year of 1992, as a small sample example. It just wasn't the right time. Additionally, we can tell from advertisements that this shutdown came about rather suddenly, stopping production on multiple future adventure game ports, including Dagger of Amon-Ra, and most surprisingly one of King's Quest VI, of which only the single hardware tie-in ad survives. We simply don't have any other info. Even after Sierra Japan KK was shut down out of the business, Sierra would continue working with other companies to export their games to Japan. Details on how this came about are rather vague. Williams doesn't even mention it in his autobiography, but Sierra would come into a partnership with Japanese media company Pioneer and enter into a joint venture with them for further publication. This merger would end up being incredibly strange, and mix a truly prolific number of exported titles, over 60, with a notable absence of any logic or consistency in how the porting was performed. Some of this turmoil might be reflective of the chaos going on in Sierra through the first half of the 1990s, as in the years leading up to the closure of Sierra Japan KK, they were also considering a merger with game company Broderbund. This actually made it to Enthusiast Press, and to give an idea of how isolated Sierra Japan KK was at this point, when Login asked Nagano about it, he had absolutely no idea. After the failure of the Japanese satellite office, Sierra would eventually end up joining with the company CUC, as Ken Williams would start listening to Sierra board member Walter Forbes, an executive at that company who was strongly pushing the merger over the objections of practically everyone else at the company, including Williams' wife. This would eventually end up isolating Ken Williams and causing the company to start a downward spiral. And the chaos of this time is reflected in the strange inconsistencies of the Sierra Pioneer ports. Williams mentions in his autobiography, in the brief time that CUC was in charge, he didn't think they had any experience at all in managing games. And the way that it plans out with Sierra Pioneer seems to back him up in an incredibly strong way. While these ports are very interesting, unfortunately a lot of them are extremely rare, coming from a confusing array of non-specific platform porting. Some of them are for DOS-V machines, some for Windows 95, some for Windows 95 PC98 variants, some for Macintosh only. None of it has any rhyme or reason to it whatsoever. To make things even more confusing, Some games were released in English despite having Japanese boxes, manuals, and reference cards, with Gabriel Knight 2: The Beast Within being a perfect example of this. If you think this sounds a little suspicious on CUC's side, and that there might be something a bit sketchy going on that would cause someone to start running a company like this, you're onto something a little bit, and we'll talk about that a little later on. One of the most notable ports to come out of Sierra Pioneer was Phantasmagoria, Roberta Williams' controversial horror game, whose adult themes and gory sections would cause problems with American retailers, even having a situation where CompUSA would refuse to stock it. Retitled Phantasm to avoid conflict with the Shigeru Tamura book Amusement Planet Phantasmagoria, a book which would get its own multimedia adventure game around the same time, adding to the confusion, data on Phantasm the PC port is rather scarce, although a demo can be obtained from sellers if you have several $100s burning in your pocket. By all accounts, it was a straightforward text translation-only port, with the most changes coming to an interesting version on the Sega Saturn. Coming on a whopping 8 CD-ROMs, this port was handled by Infini Entertainment, an offshoot of Laserdisc game company CRC Research Institute, probably most famous for the Mega CD version of Allshark and laser-active title I Will: The Story of London. Infini's history was messy, and we're not exactly sure which titles they worked on aside from the aforementioned Phantasm, Death Throttle, and an idle Mahjong game. But this somewhat rocky port was handled by having a professional Japanese dub, censoring some of the most controversial scenes into silhouette, and changing some of the music. Terribly. Guess Gregorian chant wasn't as big of a thing in Japan as it was in America in the late 90s. Ironically enough, this version has a highly detailed fan translation project, making it a game that was released in English, ported to a Japanese studio through a joint venture contract, with multiple changes, that have all been undone to be more closer to the original by fans. Thankfully, the sequel's porting would be much less chaotic. It is simply a subtitle port, and runs perfectly. However, in a sign of the strange turmoil engulfing Sierra at the time, Phantasmagoria 1's Japanese Mac port and Phantasmagoria 2's Japanese Windows port would share a release date of the week of July 18, 1997. The chaos continued with King's Quest VII. Not much is known about this port at this time. We know it was back compatible with Windows 3.1, and it was also repurposed into a Korean port as a bonus game for a subscription service, but from footage and scans we know it was a full Japanese port, with even the songs in the game being fully dubbed. Other adventure and action games would get odd retitling and ports under the Sierra Pioneer adventure as the chaos continued domestically, like Lighthouse the Dark Being, retitled The Door to Another Dimension, and Rama, here retitled as Rama Space Rendezvous. These would be much closer to their originals and feature subtitling, but Rama actually would come out with an extremely strong Japanese dub. Strangely enough though, Sierra Pioneer wouldn't be the only entity releasing Sierra games at this time, with an even stranger bedfellow existing for a notably exceptional title. Before visual novel developer and Ving offshoot Sibel would become famous for their sentimental graffiti games, they were a localizer of Western games much like Starcraft. And when Sierra Japan KK became no longer, they would pick up the slack and produce The Incredible Machine 3, a translation of the puzzle game localized to Japanese audiences. Perhaps the strangest thing Sierra Pioneer tried to do was their attempt to get into the console market. They tried to publish a Pokemon clone entitled Loose for the Sega Saturn, but the title was terminated about 30% into its development. Other than that, though, as Sierra restructured into separate departments and began a long and chaotic descent into the shell of their former selves, being passed around to multiple companies, in no small part due to CUC executive and professional Ken Williams whisperer Walter Forbes being accused as a giant committer of accounting fraud in 1998, something that would lead to his eventual arrest and conviction, Sierra Pioneer would be fairly consistent of small prints of new release games, even if their choices of which titles to select and how to adapt them remained completely baffling. Even performing localization of sports titles like front-page sports football and arcade flight sims like Red Baron 2. But as their output became more chaotic and more developers were either laid off or left the company, culminating in a mass February 1999 layoff known as Chainsaw Monday, this too would stop. Eventually, long-standing import company Imagineer would take over remaining import duties, porting the very troubled King's Quest Mask of Eternity out among other games, a game that was such a toll on Roberta Williams that Ken Williams devotes multiple chapters on how harmful it was to her soul and psyche. But the spark had just finally run out. Perhaps the best indication of Sierra's decline in quality might be the Windows 95 port of Thexter, a Sierra game done in the style of the original but with none of the soul of the first game. Slick, mass-produced, and with no care for its audience, the original creators hated it, with a level of vitriol so intense that they even brought it up in that same conference that Microcabin talked about Mystery House in. And it stands as a nice symbol of how Sierra simply lost its magic once it went through too much corporate restructuring and lost so much talent in the process. Years later, a Sierra employee would post on the Sierra Games message board with a reflection of why they thought the venture failed.
It's my recollection that nothing we ever did in Japan was a success. There wasn't a Japanese-compatible computer that was doing well in Japan, except the NEC PC 9801, which really wasn't very compatible and wasn't really used as a game machine. We weren't in the video game business and ultimately closed our office in Tokyo after losing a fair amount of money there.
That employee? Former Sierra head, Ken Williams. But they weren't the only company to have an extensive story involving adventure games in Japan, and for that we'll turn to their chief competitor. Although their story starts similar to Sierra and even more directly similarly to Origin, as they would start by releasing ports using Pony Canyon and its subcontractors, with a surprisingly decent port of the Eidolon done by unknown developers PAW Software, and a solid port of Corona's Rift performed for the MSX2, of which we know very little. When then-fledgling game division Lucasfilm Games was developing its first adventure game of sorts, a game based on the film Labyrinth, designed primarily on the Commodore 64 and with input from famous author Douglas Adams, they would rely on external contractors to develop ports for them instead of relying on Pony Canyon's notably shaky contractor infrastructure. This would result in 3 ports. A sort of early adventure game for the Commodore 64 and IBM PC, developed by David Fox with notable input from Adams, an incredibly difficult top-down maze action game with a notably excellent soundtrack, developed by Atlas and released by Tacoma Shoten for the Famicom, and the MSX2 port of the adventure game, developed by Pack-In Video, with enough changes in it to be considered a notably different port. Pack-In Video is an interesting company. Founded in 1970 with money from a slew of contemporary media groups including JVC and Tokyo Broadcasting System. Their initial concept as a company was as a home video distributor for luxury users, as the technology wasn't there yet for widespread use. And in the process of becoming that, they would end up acquiring the distribution rights for many notable foreign films. It was this somewhat confusing legal structure and a move into software that led to them being the developers for MSX Labyrinth. Pack-In Video would use these recently obtained rights to develop multiple film adaptations for the Japanese markets, with the Henson Lucasfilm project being one of them. The MSX2 Labyrinth port is interesting in that it sort of tries to split the difference between the greatly changed original adaptation and the more accurate to the film Famicom action game. In the original, you play a gender-selectable character that has been sucked into the world of the film, playing a text adventure initially, and then dragged through the screen into a graphic adventure. This was eliminated from the MSX2 port, and it's led to some amusing localization issues. The pack-in video MS-Text2 port omits the text adventure opening and gender selection, instead placing you as movie protagonist Sarah directly in the world of the film after a different introduction by David Bowie's Jareth here, hilariously giving you a little bit of side-eye occasionally, as the image of him used to base this animation on was actually taken from a making-of feature. This change leads to an amusing moment in the late game. Because the little brother being kidnapped was never a plot element in the Lucasfilm Games version, it is never brought up again outside of the introduction of the MSX game, even in the ending. Guess Sarah forgot to pick up the baby. Other than pack-in video, there are some other notable ports for 8-bit consoles, as LucasArts games would sometimes have different developers in other regions, and some of them would come out before the American releases as well. For Star Wars, Beam Software handled the NES version of it in the US, and Namco-published developer Picari Games handled its much earlier and stranger brother for the Famicom, with a staff that included future composer Hiroyuki Kawada. The Namco Picari game would end up being a much different action-adventure platformer than the one that would be more famous to US audiences, complete with bizarre touches like Darth Vader turning into multiple animals. It's an odd game, but it's not necessarily a bad one. That reputation is reserved for another computer-to-console port. The Famicom version of Maniac Mansion done by Jaleco, released a year before the American version, has a bit of an infamous reputation that precedes it, and honestly, it's incredibly well-deserved. This version has some key differences from the American one, and once again the attempt at changing character models and localizing puzzles would rear its ugly head and result in some odd designs and compromises. Famicom Maniac Mansion is a bit of a disaster, really. Instead of saving, there is a 104-character password system, which is as painful to enter as it sounds. According to TCRF, there is even a hidden message from the Japanese developers in the game apologizing for the length of the passwords. The minimization of facial features gives the characters a creepy, dead look, and rooms and puzzles are simplified. This is made even more baffling because versions shown on some Japanese variety shows clearly show different prototypes that had a great deal of improvements on the retail release, meaning that all of this could have been avoided. This absolute disaster of a port would cause LucasArts to work domestically with real-time associates instead, again doing as good of a job as they would do later on the Dynamics port of their Cyberpunk game. This resulted in the NES version that most people are familiar with. Jaleco's fumbling here would cause LucasArts to think about developing ports for foreign computers and consoles domestically, but not before elements of their earlier game would have a surprising effect, as assets out of the game Labyrinth would be utilized for the creation of Lucasfilm Games' attempt at what could best be described as a social MMO, Habitat. Created by programmers and designers Chip Morningstar, Randy Farmer, Ark Wilminer, and Janet Hunter, Habitat was an early attempt at creating a social space for multiple players to interact with each other and to lead virtual lives. It was done in cooperation with, and as a trial for, Quantum Link, an early network service that evolved from an even earlier system called PlayNet, and would be eventually renamed into a label you would be familiar with if you grew up in the 90s, due to the ubiquity of its free floppies and CD-ROMs ending up virtually everywhere. America Online. But Habitat was essentially a trial, and only for users of the Quantum Link iteration of the service. The trial ran for about 2 years, but it was eventually deemed to be a bit too costly to run, and it was eventually reworked into another system called Club Caribe. But in Japan, Habitat would have a much, much longer lifespan. To recoup some of their losses, Lucasfilm would license out Habitat to Fujitsu in Japan, starting in August of 1988. But Fujitsu would have initial trouble with converting their game to Japanese systems. Morningstar explains in an interview with Chris Garcia for the Computer History Museum.
Fujitsu was in the process of coming out with a new high-end graphical personal computer called the FM Towns that they wanted a sort of flagship online product for. They thought Habitat would be just the thing, and so they licensed Habitat from Lucasfilm. And then Lucasfilm turned around and hired Randy Farmer and I as contractors to essentially shepherd them through the process, doing all of the technological transfer and then kind of advising them when they got into trouble, because they were essentially doing a full up from scratch re-implementation of all this stuff on a newer technology platform. And so we had a relationship with Fujitsu.
Starting with a week-long seminar, Farmer and Morningstar would get to work, teaming up with engineers Kazumoto Fukui, Toru Miyoshi, and Tadayuki Tahara on working with this conversion. This started in the same month of August 1988 and took quite a bit of time, as the FM Towns itself had not yet been fully built out for retail release. On his blog, Morningstar elaborated on the subject.
We started out with a seminar explaining everything we knew about the game. We gave them copious documentation and complete source code listings. And following that, for the next couple of years, they had unlimited access to us via fax, phone and email to answer any questions they might have. We also made several visits to Japan to advise them.
And as 1988 turned into 1989, Fujitsu's version of Habitat did end up ready for launch, premiering at the massive Tokyo Cyber Amusement Park event after an initial demo in Singapore at Asia Telecom the month before. Officially going on sale in early 1990, while it wasn't initially an enormous hit, it still managed to hit over 1,000 people online in a month on its first year of trials and limited loadout, and quickly became so beloved by its community that its service would become difficult to connect to less than a month after the official, full commercial release. After some assistance by Randy Farmer, this would be mitigated on the hardware side by adding more servers and extending the times you could log on to the service until 3 o'clock in the morning. This is a great reflection on how popular this game was, as it would actually run until about 2 hours after the train stopped running in Tokyo. This variant of Habitat would run on the service NiftyServe, which was, of course, a subsidiary of Fujitsu, and it enjoyed a steady following, enough to get noticed by contemporary news outlets, have a monthly feature and some logins, and even get a rather depressing TV movie based on the service involving a virtual avatar of a computer programmer's deceased daughter, which was admittedly a very odd tack to take to sell your product. The other marketing was much more conventional, with large coverage in contemporary magazines and ports to other computers to make up the FM Towns' comparatively low user base, with versions produced for the PC-98 and other systems. Due to this success, Habitat's Fujitsu version would be iterated upon, as Morningstar and Farmer were hired to backport and improve their social MMO. And here's where it gets a little confusing. Essentially, Habitat's successors would be split into different forks of development. Morningstar and Farmer, now back in America, would release Worlds Away, another Western iteration that would be picked up by CompuServe and have a pretty decent life on it. From 1996 to 1998 in Japan, though, there would be a sequel to Habitat, but 2 different versions were developed by 2 different teams. Habitat 2 Elysium was a smaller iteration that posted graphical improvements and worked on most systems, becoming available to customers in March of 1996, and even being ported to the Sega Saturn and runnable on Fujitsu's failed console FM Towns variant, the Marty. But Habitat 2 Graceville, based on another CompuServe iteration called Dreamscape, also designed by Morningstar, would finally come out in January 1988, being a bit more impressive, working with 56K and ISDN, and posting many more features like furniture and a much larger world. Unfortunately, due to this confusion, the service would never reach the popularity of its predecessor, as many users wouldn't migrate over from Habitat's original version. This would unfortunately end up not being an option for the long term, as Habitat 1 software was one of the few instances of a software that could be completely shut down and disabled by the end of the millennium computer clock problem, the Y2K bug. And while that bug and the large amount of work required to fix it didn't quite meet the hype of various VHS and survival kits and end the entire world, it sure ended this virtual one. And with the team unable to fix it, Habitat 1 would be sunsetted on March 31st, 1999. But against the odds, Habitat simply did not die. The oldest version of Habitat would be repurposed, being retooled to gear towards women, and being relaunched as JChat less than a month after the first iteration shut down. JChat was beloved, and enjoyed a popular user base for about 11 years before finally shutting down in 2010. But the strong relationship that had been formed with Fujitsu way back during the creation of the Japanese version of Habitat 1 would not just be limited to ahead-of-their-time internet services. Fujitsu would also decide to release advanced versions of overseas classics, localized and with added features to show off the capability of their new hardware. They would work with LucasArts executive Kelly Flock to bring over the company's best-selling adventure games to the towns. Their first initial run would consist of Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade: The Graphic Adventure, Loom, and Zack McCracken and the Alien Mindbenders. The ports would be handled by a small staff, and in some cases by a single individual, longtime developer Jim Leiterman, who worked on everything from Atari research projects into exercise machines decades before Wii Fit, to 3D slot machines and modern slot car racing implementations. An employee of LucasArts from 1989 to 1994, he was working as a database designer when, according to an interview with Kay Savitz of the Atari 8-Bit podcast, Lucasfilm employees were able to see an unreleased port of the Atari classic Warlords that he had designed and would recruit him based on the strength of that. Leiterman found the idea of working with the new 32-bit systems of the FM towns incredibly appealing, and he set about converting the code for the ports. And what ports they were! Zack McCracken is, in all honesty, my least favorite of the LucasArts classics, but the port here is very interesting, upping the original 16-color palette to VGA's 256 colors and creating slightly different character designs, which, while not entirely successful, were markedly better than Police Quest 2's attempt. Login, in particular, was enamored with this port enough to run a walkthrough feature covering a significant portion of the game. The Last Crusade port fared similarly, with a beautiful CD-quality soundtrack and some updated graphics, though not quite to the extent of the Zack McCracken port. But while these ports were all baseline good, Loom is the crowning achievement here. A conversion of the EGA original to a VGA version with a Red Book soundtrack. While there are many opinions on which Loom version is the best, this is a serious contender here despite some mild censorship. And the marketing process of Fujitsu and Lucasfilm would also create tie-in products unique to this release, including a Japanese version of the prologue audio drama, and even an image CD of Loom's music arranged and performed by prolific composer Ichiko Hashimoto, who viewers might know as the composer of the soundtrack for the anime Razafon, as well as the voice of Maya in that show. That Loom CD would also have ties to LucasArts' past ports, and the deals it was a part of would help to explain LucasArts' strategies for exporting of games for other systems than just the towns, as LucasArts would actually around the same time set up a distribution deal with Victor Entertainment. The reason for this is because once again things go back to that Labyrinth game. To put things a bit too simply, Victor was the company that acquired Pack-In Video, makers of the MSX game adaptation of the fantasy classic. And Victor, who would eventually become Marvelous Entertainment later on, would acquire rights for some Lucasfilm games as part of this, which was expanded upon further negotiation in February 1991, according to Japanese magazine Monthly Coin Journal. Victor would also handle the porting of Monkey Island to the Sega CD in Japan. Despite this corporate maneuvering, it didn't really change things too much on Leiterman's side of things, as he continued to work on the ports, which remained of comparable quality to that first wave. These ports included Monkey Island 1 and 2 and Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis. Leiterman would actually be laid off around this time, but brought back on to finish off the Monkey Island 2 coding due to his extensive experience at this point with Fujitsu's FM Towns system. Leiterman would actually receive a very prominent credit on these games, honoring his skillful work as a sole programmer on these conversions. These ports are all fairly straightforward, with the only unusual thing to note being that Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis on the FM Towns could be used with controllers in its Japanese version, presumably so that it could work on the Marty. No word on any changes in how the boxing game controlled though. That seems to be pretty bad in any iteration. Once again, however, these games still wouldn't crack the Japan's top 30 despite selling very well in the USA and Europe, and once again it was not for lack of coverage, as Login magazine was particularly enamored with the town's port of Monkey Island, stating that the humor translated well, with a notable exception of the insult sword fighting minigame, which they felt was incredibly complex and must have been a nightmare to localize. These games would end up with cult status, but wouldn't really break into the market in any major way, and due to this, the remaining late 90s and early 2000s entries in LucasArts' catalog would be handled by a third, different company. Micromouse, which has nothing to do with the Fujitsu-sponsored robot programming event with which it shared a name, was a company that handled exporting foreign PC software to Japan, as well as a small hardware importer for things like early 3D accelerators. Micromouse had a surprisingly unusual catalog, including a unique Japanese port of the controversial and horror-tinged first Postal game. The company's president, Toshiro Fukuyama, was interested in doing this because he wanted the license to Star Wars and Indiana Jones. But he would also acquire one final adventure game. A product of quite a bit of iterations and not a small amount of development hell, Sean Clark's The Dig still remains a fine adventure game, even though some contemporary reviewers didn't quite get it at the time. It's a favorite of mine. It would get 2 Micromouse releases, a standalone release with a Japanese translation of the Alan Dean Foster novel based on the game, as well as one compilation release in the LucasArts Adventure Pack, which would combine the science fiction adventure with fiddly desktop arcade game Indiana Jones and His Desktop Adventures, as well as yet another port of Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis, this time for the NEC PC-98 competitor DOS-V systems. Finally, as far as adventure games, Micromouse would also handle Macintosh-only ports of Day of the Tentacle, Full Throttle, and The Curse of Monkey Island, following the lead of Sierra Pioneer with English-only translations that appeared normal to Japanese audiences, and causing the sales to go right off a cliff, judging by the rarity and obscurity of these ports. But adventure games never really felt like a focus for Micromouse, who passed on Grim Fandango to concentrate on conversions of Star Wars 90s PC games. These included a DOS-V port of Dark Forces and a Windows 95-only port of the sequel Jedi Knight Dark Forces 2. They would also convert some of the other popular subcategories, like TIE Fighter and the multiplayer sequel X-Wing vs. TIE Fighter, Star Wars cinematic action games Rebel Assault 1 and 2, notable Legends sequel Shadows of the Empire, strategy game Star Wars Rebellion, and even screensaver programs like Star Wars Inside the Magic and Star Wars Screen Entertainment. Research has indicated that these still ended up fairly small circulation ports, although they still had a bigger circulation than the adventure games Micromouse was responsible for. LucasArts would continue this piecemeal strategy until the 2000s, with the last game being ported listed as Star Wars Republic Commando in 2005. And while both Sierra and LucasArts are no longer, some of the people involved in these ports went on to very interesting careers. Jim Leiterman, after his layoff from LucasArts, would actually end up working for Sierra, as he would work on infrastructure for their online experiment, the Sierra Network, also known as the Imagination Network, and currently works as a freelance consultant and digital nomad. The designers of Thexter's last project was to work on a mobile sequel to Game Art's parody strategy game Harakiri, a game that'll be covered on the channel at some point. Ken and Roberta Williams' career needs no introduction, but they would resurface in the industry with the port of Colossal Cave a couple years ago. Chip Morningstar would have a long and illustrious career with accomplishments to make anyone envious, being one of the creators of JSON, as well as an architect for both Yahoo and PayPal in their early days. And David Fox would return to a LucasArts-related project recently as well, becoming lead programmer on Ron Gilbert's Return to Monkey Island. While these games cannot be called anything other than cult successes in Japan, the actions involved in their export caused massive ripple effects in the industry that would shape the way that genres and new technologies would evolve for decades. For Sierra, their early history would change their strategy throughout their lifespan. From the tension of Mystery House clones causing a boom in adventure game development that would indirectly lead to a standardization of adventure game style and interface design, eventually ending with the modern visual novel, to Ed Nagano and his staff's efforts of making stabs at early attempts at Japanese localization, their efforts would all eventually lead to a more considerate approach to porting, a philosophy that has paid off tremendously, at least until very recently, for works like Sega's Yakuza series. And for LucasArts, the effects of their attempts were also incredibly far-reaching, this time working like a set of dominoes. Starting with ports of a fantasy film causing changes in development across multiple platforms, leading to a disastrous port of an adventure game leading to a strategy of partial internal development, in turn setting off even more dominoes and leading to LucasArts developers acting as consultants when a game based on Labyrinth assets was retooled into a primitive MMO, and creating a relationship with a Japanese company that would cause a very talented hired engineer to work on exemplary ports for the FM towns, all finally leading for both companies to licensing musical chairs with exporters as their own companies went through domestic troubles. In the end, quality games are quality games, and just as games both have their triumphs and disasters of porting, and fan bases dedicated to singing the praises of titles ignored commercially, these stories tell us that these things are not limited by culture or geography. There's something much more universal. They're an art form, and being affected by art is just part of the human experience. Except for that skeleton puzzle in the dig. That can rot. See you next time. Special thanks to Deadeye Dave, who provided the voices of all narrated characters in this video. Dave, aside from being a personal friend, is an expert on something I know next to nothing about, the fighting game community. And here you can see a video of him talking about the history of Smash in Ireland. Some very interesting stuff. Many magazine sources for this video were derived from an ongoing scanning project, of which I have handled the debinding and digitization personally, of over 30 login magazines from 1991 to 1993. Special thanks to Hubs for providing the physical copies for scanning. Special thanks also to Ethan Johnson for some Ken Williams facts, and Markland Cadet for some fact-checking and research double-checks, as well as Bowl of Lentils for providing some information on Mystery House. Please check out his video on the creation of the Japanese version if you have not already. It's excellent. There are also multiple projects that I was able to derive information of that deserve a good look. The Reno project, part of the Habitat Restoration project, is an ongoing project to both archive and recreate that primitive MMO, and they have a truly exceptional amount of data related to that system, including design documents, interviews, contemporary articles, and all sorts of information on the various offshoots, including ones like Sanrio's version. Credits should also be given to KTJ Dragon for his research into LucasArts' Japanese ports, and for the many people involved in the ScumVM project who remain in an ongoing quest to track down some of those strange Sierra Pioneer games, and continue to try to make an interface to make adventure games work in a much better way on modern systems. And an extra special thanks to the channel's patrons: James B., Matt Leffler, Peter Tushar, Randall Eaglebauer, Andro, Yorsk, Mooware, the King of Homestyle, King Gidra, Patrick B., and Schnoo Scarpsnow. As always, subscribing to higher tiers on the Patreon will allow you access to certain bonuses, including work-in-progress versions of videos and post-video Q&As for the middle tier, and extra videos on the high tier. This time around, those extra videos will be a look at Habitat's other eventual offshoots and successors, as well as a look at Kyodai, which was Broderbund's attempt at doing the same kind of thing that Sierra tried to do when they brought over Thexter. Thank you all very much for watching and your patience in getting this together. This was a long one that took a lot of research and a lot of myth dispelling. This video was 100% human effort, as you can probably tell by my cropping skills. No generative AI was used in the making of this project. I appreciate your continued support, and I'll see you next time. Special thanks to Deadeye Dave, who provided the voices of all narrated characters in this video. Dave, aside from being a personal friend, is an expert on something I know next to nothing about, the fighting game community. And here you can see a video of him talking about the history of Smash in Ireland. Some very interesting stuff.